Thanks. It looks like I've got some fans in the front row, I think. All right. Thank you all for having me here. I really enjoy coming to Thailand. I think this is my fifth trip to Bangkok. I just got off a plane about 2 hours ago, so hopefully I'm not too jet lagged. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to build startup ecosystems, actually startup and investor ecosystems in emerging markets, and some of that will be about Southeast Asia and about Thailand. A little bit about 500 startups as well. So what is 500 startups? Well, we're a venture capital fund. We have about 250 million under management, and we've invested in over 1,000 companies, actually around 1,500 companies or so. We have people in about 20 different countries around the world. Actually, 3 of them are here in Bangkok. Krating, Mu, and Mamio are our team members here in Thailand. They're running the 500 Tuk Tuks Fund. We do a lot of things that are not just investment. Actually, we do education, we do content, we do community, we run events. I actually just took a group of about 30 or 40 people over an investor trip over the last 2 weeks across China, Japan, and Hong Kong just a few weeks ago. We've been investing in companies since about 2010, and looks like it's working so far. My background, I've been in Silicon Valley for about 25, 26 years, I guess. Started out as a software engineer and developer, and gradually also became an entrepreneur. Worked at PayPal for a few years with some really amazing folks there. And I started investing as an angel investor about 12 years ago, and then at Founders Fund about 7 or 8 years ago, and we got 500 startups off the ground in 2010. So a little bit more about 500. So what is our mission? We're really trying to provide capital to people who are smart. A lot of times we work not just with founders, but also with other investors. And we're also here to provide education and help people learn about what it is to build a startup or what it is to do investing. Part of our goal is really to help people build functional startup ecosystems. Now, what do I mean by functional? Well, that means that there's capital available for people who are building companies. There's later stage investors who will come in after us and after others, whether they're accelerators or VC funds. There's availability of exits. That's also sometimes challenging in emerging markets. And we like to say, have fun, get stuff done. HFGSD is kind of our hashtag. So when we started 500, my partner, Christine Tsai, was at Google and YouTube for about 7 years. We noticed one thing about investing that was pretty important. We would find that most of our investments didn't work. A lot of them resulted in not any return at all. A few of them worked reasonably well, and a small number worked really, really well. And that idea basically came to us that, well, we really want to be investing in lots of companies if we want to have a good shot at getting those large outcomes. So Christine came from Google, I came from PayPal. We decided we'd bring a lot of our engineering and marketing background to bear. But we didn't want to just be investing in Silicon Valley. We also wanted to practice that investment globally in lots of places around the world. Our focus is on seed stage investing. That means usually after there's already some kind of product and maybe some early customer usage, but probably before traditional Series A and B investors. And part of our investments go through an accelerator program that we run in Silicon Valley, both in San Francisco and Mountain View. Usually we do about 30 to 50 companies per batch, and we do about 200 companies per year through that program. That's a structured curriculum where we really work with companies on how to do design, how to do distribution, get them ready to pitch to investors, and that culminates in a demo day, usually over about a 4-month period. But we also do seed stage investing all over the world, not just through our accelerator program. Last year we did over 500 investments in total, so about half of those went through our accelerator program. The other half were not through that program. We have a really significant emphasis on customer acquisition. In particular, growth hacking and marketing are one of the things that we think is most important for startup entrepreneurs. We know there's a lot of smart people out there who are great at building code, but once they build the product, they still need to get that in the eyes and ears of the customer. They need to make sure that that is adopted by people. And lastly, like I said, we do a lot of other things than just investment. We hold events, we do education, and we now have a very large community of founders all over the world, actually about over 3,000 people now. We are in a lot of different places. Actually, about half the team is in California, but the other half is spread across 20 different countries. We're in 10 countries in Asia. Probably about 30 people on the team are spread across all of different parts of Asia. And we've actually been investing in around the world. Probably about 500 of our investments are outside the US. We didn't start necessarily going crazy on the global stuff. That was something that we gradually realized was an opportunity for us, beginning first in Brazil and Mexico and Latin America, then in India, later in Asia, both in China and Southeast Asia, and now last year we really expanded quite a bit, including here in Thailand, as well as the Middle East, and we hope to expand a lot more in the next few years. Talking a little bit about where we play in the investor ecosystem. So mostly we're investing at the earliest stages, usually at the accelerator stage when angel investors are coming in or when seed stage or micro VC firms are investing. So usually we're that first check or one of the first checks, probably between $0 to $1 million. There are lots of other investors we hope also come in after us that invest at Series A and B, and maybe if we're lucky, even more. However, a lot of times we don't necessarily see those same ecosystems around the world that we do in the US. In the US, we have the luxury of having built an ecosystem that's been around for maybe 40 or 50 years, and there's lots of different types of investors. There's lots of angel investors, there's lots of accelerators, there's lots of VC funds, probably over 500 active VC funds in the US. But that's not always true in other parts of the world. A lot of times we hear investors talk about wanting to see more development in their communities, more entrepreneurs getting to Series A and B level. However, usually the problem isn't the entrepreneurs. Most of the time what we find is that actually the investor side is really where there's like a little bit of experience missing. And sometimes we need to see the development of not just the later stage VC funds, but the ones that are earlier. So in particular, accelerator programs, seed stage investors, and Series A investors. That first sort of 100,000, maybe up to $1 or $2 million is what's really critical to get companies off the ground. And so in this diagram, what I showed here is, you know, it might take 1,000 startups, 1,000 bootstrap startups in someone's garage or in someone's basement to really get to enough companies that you see that big billion-dollar unicorn type of company that everybody always talks about. And you might, you know, see some kind of cut down in each of those stages. It might get you to 300 companies that get to an accelerator, 100 that get to seed stage, and then 30 that get to like Series A and B, and then furthermore. So what's different about building tech startups these days? Well, the biggest thing is that it's cheaper than ever before. There's a lot less capital that's required than what the companies required maybe 10 or 20 years ago. We don't have to spend nearly as much money on hardware, on software. A lot of services are in the cloud. Just dramatic reductions in cost. But probably more important than cost is the access to customers. Through global platforms on search, social, and mobile, we can reach billions of people around the world. Literally billions of people, probably about 3 billion people now, and over the next 5 to 10 years, probably another 3 billion people. And we see those folks on search engines, on social platforms, now on messaging platforms as well. And we can make lots of little bets in those companies as they're developing. Not all of them are going to work, but it doesn't cost us anywhere near as much money as it used to. So if we compared kind of what those startups look like, maybe say 10, 15, 20 years ago to today, before, say, 2000, it might have cost 5 or 10 or even more $1 million to get those companies off the ground. They would have to have bought, you know, hardware, maybe pay for database software, probably pay for, you know, expensive bandwidth, and there weren't really that many people online at the time, probably less than 100 million people online maybe a couple of decades ago. So it was kind of expensive. It took a long time to build those products. There wasn't nearly as much plumbing or infrastructure back then. And there were fairly limited sources of capital, mostly in the US. Those were in California and in Boston. If you compare that to today, what you see is a lot of other infrastructure that's much easier to use and a lot cheaper and a lot faster to get startups off the ground. So we have infrastructure for storage, for e-commerce, for email, for payment, for social platforms, for pictures and video, just tons and tons of services that are available online that are not very expensive anymore. There's a lot more people online, and there's a lot of sources of capital. Even though we're still growing those sources of capital, there's many more places to raise funding than ever before. So we can build services maybe in just a couple of weeks or months, and a lot less money than what it would have cost maybe 10 or 15 years ago. As I mentioned before, the biggest change really is the fact that we have access to customers all over the world. And just like amazing amounts of growth has happened in the last 5 to 10 years. This is something that's really a pretty recent phenomenon. Just in the last 5 years, you've seen messaging platforms like WeChat, like Line, Facebook bought WhatsApp for a very large sum, and also video and picture platforms like Instagram and Pinterest, also Facebook and YouTube doing more with video. All these platforms that allow people to communicate and people to try out new types of software and communicate with people all around the world, faster than ever before. So now we have a lot of ways to reach people and a lot less cost in reaching those folks. And so the things that used to take us a lot more time don't take that much time at all now. Going from concept or an idea to a functional prototype and maybe to a first customer might only take us a couple of months. In some cases, maybe even just a couple of weeks. And what we're looking for when we like to invest is after we can see that that functional product is out and that early customers or users are starting to test out that product and they're spending time or dollars and they're coming back again to use those products. And that's when things get interesting. When we can start seeing that people are using the product, then we want to kind of take a bet and see if that product will scale. Hopefully the unit economics or the ways that people spend money to build product and acquire customers, hopefully they're making at least a dollar and a penny for every dollar they're spending on acquiring those customers. And before things really get big, before there's a lot of evidence or traction when prices get really expensive, that's when we want to invest, because that's when those startups need that capital. After they've already gotten a lot of visibility and a lot of funding, it's maybe not as hard for them, to get rolling. But those first 3 to 6 months, the first year, is where it's really important for that first $50,000 to $100,000, maybe up to the first $1 million to get off the ground. And what's important to us is not the traditional business plan. If I can emphasize one thing, business plans are a waste of time mostly. And in fact, I would argue that they're actually usually lies. In fact, investors who are asking for business plans are really mostly encouraging those startups to lie to them about what they think the future is going to be about. Now, this may sound kind of radical. I'm up here saying, I don't even look at business plans. We don't need business plans. Well, the reason is because startups are highly volatile. The experiments that startups are doing are not trying to predict the next 5 years of growth. It's really probably trying to predict the next 1 week of their product and whether they can get customers to use that product and come back. So most of our experiments that we want to see with our companies are really product experiments and customer acquisition experiments that are very short-term in nature. In fact, they're probably not more than just weeks or months. We might want to see marketing plans. We might want to see how people are going to spend money to acquire those customers. And we want to see the results of those experiments. If I tried to put this particular product out or this application, or maybe I try this email marketing campaign or this messaging campaign, what are the results of those? How many users or customers can I acquire? What's the cost of acquiring those customers? How long does it take to get to revenue? Will they pay? Will they come back again? The startup metrics and that set of experiments, that's what we really want to understand. We want to see that those companies are able to test and see if they can get positive results from their marketing and from their product decisions and from the dollars that they're spending on customer acquisition. And so most of the time, we are not looking for these long business plans. We're not looking for, somebody to write a nice novel. I mean, great, there's lots of people out there who go to business schools and can write a nice business plan, but I'm not investing in screenplays. I'm not investing in people who are predicting the future. What I'm investing in is the products that they're building and the customers that they're going to acquire. Right? Now, we do look at whether those unit economics are positive. When they're acquiring that customer, when they're building that product, what does it cost to build that widget or build that application or get that customer? And when will they monetize? Will they get any money out of that? Will they get enough money to cover those costs? What's the timing of that revenue and expense? Right? We want to build a financial equation that helps us understand, can this business be profitable, at least on a unit economic basis, and at some point, might it grow to a point where it generates money? We also might want to learn how they're able to get other investors on board. Are they able to communicate their ideas and their story, what their customers are, what their market is, and communicate that effectively to other investors to raise capital? So how about on the investor side? What's changed on the investor side? Well, there's been a lot of changes that happened on the investor side. There's been two really big financial crises that have happened in 2000, 2001, and then again in 2008 and 9. And those crises taught us a lot as investors. They taught us to really, understand that sometimes when people are taking companies public, they're not always based on perfection. In fact, in a lot of cases, they were not at all based on perfection. In 2008, there was a lot of real estate crisis that bled over into the startup world, and there was a lack of capital for a short period of time there. But along the way, we started to get a lot more efficient about building companies. We've also started to get a lot more efficient about how we invest in companies. And we're seeing better monetization, better payments. We're seeing global distribution platforms. And we're seeing startup ecosystems that involve not just traditional venture capital, but also accelerators and angel investors and online funding platforms like Kickstarter and AngelList and others. Now, what's great about a lot of those changes is that we can make lots more investments than we've ever made before, but we can make them in very small amounts. So rather than just putting one $5 million investment and hoping that that company is successful, we're now able to maybe spend that $5 million on, say, 100 little $50,000 bets. Out of those 100 bets, maybe only 20 get to the next stage or seed stage. Maybe we bet 500,000 on those 20, and then out of those 20, maybe 5 of them get to the point of raising Series A capital that might be millions of dollars. So that popular model of doing accelerators and seed funds started happening maybe about 10 years ago in 2005 to 2010. First Round Capital was one of the first micro VCs that started around 2004. Accelerators and incubators, Y Combinator and Techstars and ourselves. And then more recently, funding platforms that allow for customers and for retail market investors to also put money into startups. So as we've seen that industry develop, now we have a global market of investors, not just venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road, but all kinds of private investors, corporate investors, accelerators, even governments are now getting into the startup and innovation game. But one thing I want to impress upon you, a lot of investors come to startups from the real estate industry. Startups are not real estate. And let me say that again. Startups are not real estate. Now, what do I mean by that? If I make an investment in real estate, probably the next year, if I buy a house, that house is still going to be there. 2 years later, that house probably still going to be there. 3 years later, that house still going to be there. Maybe if I'm in Bangladesh and there's a typhoon, that house might not be there. But otherwise, the house is probably going to be there. Now, startups, if I invest in a startup a year later, is it going to be there? Sometimes it won't. 2 years later, is it going to be there? Probably only about 10 or 20% of them will be there. By the third year, probably almost 90% of the startups that you invested in are gone. So now, if you invested in a house knowing that there was probably a 50% chance that house wasn't going to be there the next year, and maybe an 80% chance it was going to be there 2 or 3 years later, would you buy that house? I don't know if you would buy that house. Maybe you would actually spread that out and buy like 20 houses, or at least 20 different tents, because you're not sure if that house is going to be there next year. Well, that's the issue with startups. Startups fail a lot. Startups fail a lot. And so it would be foolish to put all your money in just one house if you knew that house was going to wash away in a flood the next year. Well, that's why we don't do that with startups either. We spread it out. We put a lot of our bets into a number of different startups. And the thing is, although a lot of those startups might die in the next year or 2 or 3, a few of those startups, the ones that survive, the ones that grow, can become a lot more valuable. And so that house that you invest in, well, it might be worth 10 or 20% more the next year, but it's probably not going to be worth 100% more the next year. And the next year after that, it probably won't be worth 100% more. But that's what happens with startups. Some of those startups will grow 20 times in value in a period of 3 or 4 or 5 years. Sometimes they'll grow 50 to 100 times in value. So the difference between startups and real estate is that real estates are usually sort of a stable bet, and the house is probably going to be there. Startups, not so much. A startup's probably going to die, it's probably going to disappear, but every once in a while, 1 out of maybe 10 or 20 startups grows really, really big. Right? And that's why investing in startups makes sense. That's why investing in a portfolio of companies, hopefully at least 20, maybe 100, maybe even 500 startups might be a good idea. So that's what we did, actually. When we first started investing about 6 years ago, this says 500 companies. Our last fund, our third fund, we actually invested in over 600 companies. But our first fund, we invested in about 250 companies. And 5-6 years later, about 20 of those companies are now worth over $100 million. 2 of those companies are worth $500 million, and one of them is worth over $1 billion. Right? So we actually saw about 8% of our portfolio grow really like 20x in value, and maybe 1 to 2% of our portfolio grow 50 to 100 times in value. But the other part of that was half of that portfolio went to zero. Right? So like I said, there's got to be diversification going on there because most things fail, most things don't work, and most things go to zero fast. But a few things will survive and will grow a lot. So I wrote a blog post called 99 VC Problems, but a batch ain't one. For those who are Jay-Z fans, you might know he has a song of similar name. And what I was trying to explain was why portfolio matters for returns. And this is a graph that shows as you increase the number of investments in your portfolio from, say, 5 companies to 100 companies, your chances of having a positive return almost double. In fact, they go from maybe 1x to 2x to 3x in an overall portfolio size. So it really does matter to make a lot more investments. And this is a classic mistake that a lot of investors who start investing in startups make. They'll say, well, I'll just try it out. I'll just try out startup investing. And they'll make one investment. And of course, on average, that one investment's going to fail. And they'll be like, oh, this startup investing thing, that's not for me. And they're missing the whole point. They're missing the opportunities for portfolio diversification and for massive increase that happens on an occasional basis. So everybody's excited about these unicorns, the stories about companies that are growing to be billions of dollars. But what do you think the chances are of investing in a unicorn company? Well, it's not 0, but it's not 10%. Actually, according to CB Insights, the number of times that you will invest in a company that's called a unicorn or a billion-dollar valuation is probably about 1%. For traditional venture capital Series A investors, after 5 years, about 1% of their investments will get to billion-dollar unicorn status. Now, let's say maybe if you're really good that you might get that to happen 2% of the time, but it's not that much more than 1 to 2% of the time. Now, that doesn't sound very exciting. I'm only going to find that big investment 1 to 2% of the time? That seems like a bad bet. Well, if we build a model, and let's say that we find that unicorn or 50x outcome about 2% of the time, and then we find a large win, let's say that large win is maybe about a 15x return, and that happens 5% of the time. And then maybe we get a small win close to 20% of the time, that might only be 3x. But still, we're going to see half of our investments go to 0, and another 25%, maybe we just get a little bit of money back. Now, if I look at that mathematically weighted portfolio, my theoretical return is actually over 2x, which sounds pretty good. But if I only make 15 bets, on average, I'm not going to find any of those unicorn big wins, and I'm not even going to find any of those medium-sized wins. And then in that particular outcome, I'll probably lose half my money. Not very exciting. Now, if I doubled that portfolio and made it 30 companies, now what happens? Well, now I have a statistically reasonable shot of getting a medium-sized win, but it's still no guarantees of getting that big unicorn win. So now maybe I'll just get even money, or maybe I'll just make a little bit more than 1x, but that's not very exciting. But now if I increase my portfolio size to 100 companies, now I've got a reasonable chance of getting that unicorn. I've got a pretty good chance of getting that large win. And now you'll see that maybe 7 of those 100 companies result in interesting financial outcomes. And on the aggregate basis, now I've got more than a 2x return. And that might still take me 5 to 10 years to get that 2 to 2.5x return. But now I've got an interesting way to make money. Now that matters a lot. That difference between having a portfolio size of just 15 companies to 30 companies to 100 companies has a pretty dramatic outcome on my financial return. And it makes sense, right? If I'm only going to get a unicorn company 2% of the time, I better at least have 50 to 100 companies to ensure myself that I'm going to get that big win. Right? This is really just basic math. There's nothing kind of rock star crazy about this. It's just looking at the average percentage for big wins happening and then modeling a right-sized portfolio. So now that we have an idea for how to diversify our returns, we've seen some of the benefits of decreasing cost in building startups, and we know a little bit more about how those startups get built. Let's see how we can apply some of those same philosophies to investing. So if I think about like where startups start from and where they end up, there's a lot of different points on that curve where I could be investing. Now, the tendency is to want to invest late. You want to kind of wait until there's not much risk in the system. You want to kind of catch the companies when they're already making money. You know, maybe they're already making 5, 10, 20 million. They're already worth $100 million. And then you kind of want to jump in. Well, that's kind of great. But the problem is, if you don't funnel that ecosystem with capital in the early stages, guess what? You're not going to get any of those companies. So for a country like Thailand, where you have 80 million people and you have a lot of potential for startups, if you sit around and wait for Series A and Series B companies to happen, you're going to be waiting for a long time. Now, there's a few folks like Mu who can build a company like Ukbi and get that off the ground, bootstrapped, maybe without a lot of capital, but not too many people can do that by themselves. Usually, you need investors, you need debt and equity capital to get those companies off the ground. So that early stage, when things are very risky, that early stage is where we need more investors, we need more capital in those ecosystems. Silicon Valley didn't become Silicon Valley overnight. It didn't just magically start producing startups and entrepreneurs. There were decades, 50, 60 years worth of ecosystem development, entrepreneurship, platform companies, venture capitals. There's all sorts of things that created Silicon Valley to make it what it is today. If you want to create that ecosystem in other parts of the world, you have to do those same types of things. You need to build entrepreneurship, you need to build education, you need to build other venture capital firms. The great thing is today it doesn't cost nearly as much as it used to cost getting Silicon Valley off the ground. So we are going to emphasize that early stage with functional prototypes and early users and customers, that's the time where we want to start investing. We want to make lots of those little bets because we know the attrition rates are high. If we're going to get those companies to the seed stage capital and the Series A capital, we need to make a lot of those little bets, and we need to make them early, when things are actually kind of risky, not when investors want to wait until the rest of that ecosystem gets built. And so again, we're thinking about where do we want to start making those bets? Well, we don't necessarily want to invest in just ideas. Ideas are great, but you know, there's a lot of people with ideas who never get a product out the door. And actually, there's a lot of people who build a product that no customers actually care about. And so the two tests that we really want to see is that entrepreneur or someone on that entrepreneur's team can build a product, go from idea to a functional product or an app or a service, and that somebody thinks it's useful. Somebody starts using it, or somebody starts paying for it, somebody who's not your mom. That's kind of important, right? And then we hope that scales up, and we hope that they make money, and maybe, you know, with a little bit of capital, they can kind of improve those unit economics and get better. And if we're lucky, it might become a very big scalable business, and maybe we get an exit someday. But again, remember, probably most of the time we won't. So what we want to think about is kind of this 3-stage of development. First one is really incubation. That's where they're developing a product and testing for customers. The seed stage, where we put a little bit more money, we want to see if we can grow the market. And then really, you know, venture capital, traditional venture capital, where we're trying to maximize growth or maximize revenue. Now, the great thing about this is because of the advances in how we build startups, this is not as expensive as it used to be, and it doesn't take as much time as it used to be. So we can make a lot more bets at a lot less cost. So what does that first phase look like? Well, hopefully this first phase doesn't cost anything. Hopefully we don't even have to invest here. But maybe let's say it costs between $0 to $100,000. This costs a couple of weeks or months of time. It might be a small team of just 1 to 3 founders. And their goal is really to just get a product out the door that somebody uses. And maybe even somebody pays for it. But mostly this is just to test for whether we can build a product and whether someone thinks it's interesting. And then maybe we'll gather some metrics about that and see if we want to take the next step. Now, a lot of people will fail at this stage. A lot of people will not be able to get a product out the door, or they won't get very many users or customers. But at least we're failing fast and cheap, right? Out of this stage, if they get to the next stage, well, now maybe they've got a product that people care about and use. Now maybe we add a few more people to the team. We start adding maybe some marketing folks, some sales folks, some customer support folks. Maybe we put a little money in, maybe a couple $100,000, or at least enough to give them maybe 6 to 12 months worth of runway. And now we're trying to see how many people might use this product. What does it cost to acquire those customers? What's the revenue that gets generated? When does that happen? And can we start building this financial equation for the cost structure and the revenue that it takes to get customers? And hopefully that's a profitable equation. And our goal here is to see that the market is large, that many people use it. And again, hopefully there's some kind of monetization. And again, lots of people will fail here. We won't get all of those products to scale. Some of those products won't be profitable. Some of those founders won't be able to organize or hire or lead their teams. Some of them won't be able to raise capital. Lots of reasons why startups might fail, but at least some of them might validate that there is a market and there are customers, and maybe they can grow bigger. Okay, and now after that stage, then we get into traditional venture capital. Okay, we know we've got a product, we know we've got a market, we think we can make money, we think we can scale up. Let's put some money in. Let's write some $1 million checks. Let's hire a big team. Let's start growing, whether that's users or revenue or profit. Let's try and go big. And hopefully some of those get to a large sustainable business. This is where we create lots of jobs. We create lots of economic value. We hopefully might get an exit if we're an investor. This is where it gets really interesting. Now, the problem is that you can't start here. You don't get to start here. You don't get to just wait and see that companies are already viable and scalable and have lots of potential. You have to do these other two steps. And you probably need to do lots of those. You probably need 100 of these to get to one of these. Need 100 little experiments with lots of people who fail and lots of people who waste time and things don't work and your mom kicks you out of the garage and your customers don't buy anything, your venture capitalists don't give you money. You know, you maybe decide that startups aren't for you. And a few of you get a little bit of money and a few of you will get to the next stage and okay, it's an interesting product, but it's not a big product. It's not that interesting, but a few of them will get to that third stage. Right? The problem is you need to do that work to get through these stages before you get to that big one. All right, so now let's think about how do we model investor ecosystems. If this is our goal, we got to make lots of these little bets to really have startups have a chance to succeed and get to a few big companies. What does that take? Well, the most important thing, let me take a break for a second. I get a little excited. Even though money and capital and education and platforms are really important, you know what the most important thing is? The most important thing is optimism and belief. The belief that I can do it in the face of all that negative, not very good odds, that I still think I can do it. In fact, it's not really even optimism and belief. It's insanity. It's craziness. Like those numbers I told you, 5%, maybe 2%, that's it. Those are the only numbers that are going to succeed. Do you want to start a business where you have a 5% chance of succeeding? That kind of sucks. That's not very smart. In fact, all you smart people, you should probably do other things like become an accountant or become a doctor or a lawyer or something else where you're going to get a real paying job. You know, entrepreneurship is for crazy people. Crazy people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. Some of those people went to Harvard and they dropped out. If they dropped out of Harvard, how dumb could you be to drop out of Harvard? You got a pretty much guaranteed gig if you graduate from Harvard, except occasionally you drop out of Harvard and you end up being a billionaire. Elon Musk. I met Elon Musk in 1995, about 20 years ago. He was running a company that was about 8 people at the time. I think the company was called Local Site. It was an earlier version of Yelp that was mapping businesses and what they do, kind of like a rating system. And he was kind of a crazy person. He was a little bit of a nerd. I wasn't really sure what the hell he was going to do. You know, he actually was a rocket scientist. He got a degree in nuclear physics. I wasn't sure he was going to be a great entrepreneur. Turns out Elon Musk was a pretty fucking good entrepreneur. He was a pretty damn good entrepreneur. But he was crazy. And he did 3 businesses that were each after each other crazy. SpaceX and Tesla and Solar City were all crazy. Very low probabilities of success. Now, Elon Musk is brilliant. Everybody thinks, oh, Elon Musk is awesome. Well, you know what? Elon Musk was not an accountant. He was not a doctor. He was not a lawyer. He was a crazy, insane person who kept betting every time all in on his ideas and on his craziness. That's what Silicon Valley is all about. Now, the thing is, any one of those entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley who's betting all in on themselves, 90% of those people are wrong. 90% of those people are going to fail. It's not very exciting. They'll work a lot, they won't get paid very much, they'll have a lot of hard times, and they'll fail. But 10% of them might succeed. 1% of them might succeed really well. And the thing is, in Silicon Valley, there's thousands of us who are crazy. Reid Hoffman, former colleague of mine at PayPal, used to say, entrepreneurship is like jumping off a cliff and trying to build the plane on the way down, or build the parachute on the way down. Right now, most people, you jump off a cliff and try to build a plane or build a parachute. You don't. You die. You hit the ground. But every once in a while, somebody figures that out, and then the other 99 people, like, oh, wow, he's got an airplane, or he's got a parachute, or I'm going to jump in that parachute, or jump in that plane. And that's actually what happens in Silicon Valley, right? Any place else around the world, you have crazy people jump off a cliff, they die. In Silicon Valley, 100 of us jump off a cliff together. And some of us die, and a few of us actually build the plane. A few of us actually find that parachute. A few of us create billion-dollar companies. 3 of them. 3 of them. Right? And so that low probability, that insanity, that's what we nurture in Silicon Valley. Sounds crazy, sounds stupid, not very quantitatively smart, except in the aggregate. Now, we need all those other things too, but the most important thing is optimism and belief. And then we need capital and education and people and acquirers and other financiers. And some of us need to get in shape a little bit more. All right, so who is an entrepreneur? Well, it's not somebody who just wants to start a business. A lot of people want to start a business. A lot of people don't want to work for somebody else. They can't wake up early in the morning. They don't really like authority. It's not even just someone who wants to run a business, right? That's not enough. You actually have to run a sustainable business, a business that works, that gets to profitability someday, we hope. And really, I would say it's someone who wants to run a large and profitable business. Now, I would say that that's probably, on the order of, let's say, 100 people or a $10 million revenue business. That's when it starts to get interesting. Now, actually, most of the world's businesses are not that big. Most of the world's businesses, more than 50% of the world's GDP is small business less than 100 people. More than half the world is small businesses just like that. So if you can run a $10 million a year profitable business that employs 100 people, guess what? You are driving the economy. You are the person we would find. That woman, that man, that person that can run that business and create 100 jobs profitably, you are the engine of our society. You are what is creating innovation and jobs. It's not Google and Facebook and all these other ones. Yeah, those are great, and they do create lots of jobs. But the engine of our society around the world is people who run medium-sized small businesses, less than 100 people. That's what drives people forward. We need more of those. And what's great is we have a really good recipe on how to build startups these days to do more of that. You don't have to be the next Google to be successful as an entrepreneur. You need to build a sustainable business that employs some people and becomes profitable. Now, in emerging markets, it's a little bit more challenging than the US, right? Or in Europe or China. Those are big markets where there might be 500 million to 1 billion people. You might have limited internet access, or maybe your mobile and smartphone penetration still maybe only around 20 to 30% or growing. Online payments might be challenging. Physical logistics, delivery, and distribution might be challenging. But those first 3 issues are probably going away in the next 5 years. Most challenges that we have in emerging markets around payment, around smartphone penetration, even around physical logistics are not going to be that much of a challenge in another 5 years. Probably 80 to 100% of most emerging markets will have access to a smartphone. Most of them will be able to pay online. At least half of them already do. We might still have the issue of smaller markets, but you start to realize that even 50 to 100 million person countries are pretty big markets when everybody's online and people are able to make payments. Now, the other three challenges we have there are still challenging. We might have a small number of venture capital firms. This is one that we have to work on. There might be a long time to exit that we can't necessarily change. We might be able to help some of those companies get acquired through other incentives, tax policy, business policy. But still, we have to work with a market where maybe there hasn't been a lot of historical exits or there aren't a lot of acquirers, although that's starting to change as well. You're starting to see global acquirers from the US, from China, from Europe, from other places around the world start to acquire across borders. You're starting to see non-technology companies acquire their technology equivalents because they know they need to change and innovate. But we still need to work on these problems if we're going to make our ecosystems better. Now, going back to that diagram, I just want to emphasize this funnel may not be perfect. You may not have the exact numbers here, but if you think about what does it take to get a unicorn? What does it take to get that billion-dollar company? It might take 1,000 companies in a garage to get there. It might take 300 startups that go to accelerators or 100 seed stage startups or at least 30 Series A or B companies. Now, I put a big box around those, one that says tough but critical, talking about accelerators, seed stage startups, and Series A and B startups. And underneath each of those were accelerators, micro VC funds, and early stage VC funds. So recently, the government of Thailand announced that they're going to put $500 million, 500-some million dollars into startups, which is great. I love to hear that. That's a real commitment from the government to help startups get off the ground. But how are they going to do that? What's the way that they're going to deploy that $500 million? Well, this is the way that they should deploy it. They should actually find and help create the investors that are going to deploy that capital. Don't put that $500 million into just one company, and don't try and do it all yourselves. I don't think that government folks, even though they're well-intentioned, maybe are the best people to help identify which startups deploy that capital. But let's say we help fund 20 or 30 accelerators, maybe on $1 million each. Maybe we help some micro VC funds get off the ground for $5 to $10 to $20 million each. And maybe we get some of those Series A and B funds that get off the ground for $50 to $100 million each. Those investments, those funds and actors are what's going to then, in turn, put money into startups. And again, realize that attrition is going to be high. A lot of those investments are going to go to zero, so don't put too much money in any one of them. You want to diversify, just like we talked about diversifying in startups, we want to diversify across these funds as well. And we want to stage that capital so that we have early stage investors at accelerators making the earliest bets, and seed stage investors making bets on those companies that succeed there, and then Series A and B, and then later stage capital. So, in summary, solutions for investors in emerging markets. Well, the biggest one is just to increase the number of investments that we're making, increase our portfolio size, probably decrease check size. I always tell people, if you're going to be investing in startups, you might think about, okay, making one $100,000 investment. Actually, what I would say is make 10 $10,000 investments. So steal that zero from your check size and add it to the number of investments you're going to make. We need to increase the number and frequency of acquirers. We need to figure out ways that we can help larger companies who want to acquire startups make that job easier and encourage that through business and tax policy. In particular, fund of funds for countries. This is what I was just talking about. Don't necessarily deploy all that money directly into startups. Don't deploy it into just one fund, but create a fund that funds other funds and make those funds stage sensitive, so where they're doing that. You might even think about ways that you could create a liquidity fund for those investments that are doing well, so that the investors who have companies that progress maybe sell some of that stake back to a vehicle that allows them to get some liquidity and then recycle and make more investments. You might want to look at use of real estate as a way to provide some kind of hedge or synthetic form of liquidity. So maybe I can put some of the money into startups or funds and some of the money into real estate. And as those startups progress and as those companies and funds progress, the value of that real estate might go up as well. And the real estate might be liquid on the market while the companies are not quite liquid just yet. And then we want to look at incentives for all this behavior to happen positively. So that's a lot. That's not so easy. But I hope I've given you some ideas for how to make a startup ecosystem work and how to help startups get started and hopefully how to help investors get started as well. I'm really excited about investing in Thailand. We've made over 20 investments in Thailand startups so far. I hope we make at least another 20 investments this year and hopefully a lot more next year, and I hope you'll join me. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm so exciting to say thank you very much ขอบคุณมากๆนะคะ Can we say thank you once again to Dave McClure? Thank you. It's surprisingly that we can meet Dave McClure in person for Startup Thailand 2016. Thank you very much. You have a lot of fans today, Kun Dev.